Today, out of our culture section, we're going to be talking about a tweet that was put out by Lecraes, what it said, why we should care, and what I think about it. First, let me welcome you to the channel. Glad that you're back. Thanks for taking the time to watch this today. All my friends and frenemies, glad to see you on the other side of this camera lens, wherever you may be, whenever it is. I'm glad you're here. This is where we apply logic and conviction to culture, news, politics, and whatever else grabs my attention. I'm C. Scott, and this is my view. So about a week ago, Lecraes put out this tweet, and the tweet was concerning politics, but it's in our culture section, and I just want to talk about it a little bit because I want to talk about what he says from a Christian's point of view, from a conservative's point of view, from my point of view, and it's gotten a lot of attention. Some other people talked about it, so I figured why not give you my 2 cents. So I'm going to put this tweet up so you can see it in its totality, and then I want to talk about it piece by piece. If you know Lecraes, if you followed him in his career for any period of time, over the last many years, he's always been one who was kind of known in the Christian rap community as a person who was constantly trying to reach out to the other side. On one hand, people would say that it was good, and he was trying to reach out to people who were unsaved, whether he would be performing on their songs or getting secular artists to perform on his songs. And people would say that he was basically trying to bridge the gap or to bring other people over to our side to be a good influence. The other side of the argument is it often looked like instead of being the influencer, he was being influenced, or just sometimes it would seem like he'd kind of rather be on the secular side than the Christian side. And so, there was some back and forth. I'm not here to judge that. He's supposed to do what God has for him to do and what's in his conscience, what's in his heart to do. But that's kind of one of those things that has been apparent in his background before we get into what he actually said. So about a week ago, he puts out this tweet. Like I said, it got some other attention, and he brings up some points that I really want to focus on and look at, because he's saying this as a Christian artist. He's saying this to a lot of other Christians and believers, a lot of young people who listen to his music, and a lot of people sometimes look at tweets and they just accept information. And I like to not just accept information, but I want to think about it, see if it lines up with what I believe. The first part of his tweet, he says it feels good to be on the right side of history. That is one of the phrases that I think is overused, that I'm tired of hearing, that I don't like. I think it's a really, really childish phrase. It's a silly thing to say. It's kind of virtue signaling. It's, oh, I'm on the right side of history, as if the people in history were on the wrong side of history. Of course, we look back into history and we see things that were done wrong. Hindsight is 20/20. We see people that made bad decisions or they made mistakes or whatever. But typically in history, which is in the present, people think that they're doing the right thing at the time, based on the information that they have, based on what they're feeling there. It's easy for us to look back into history and say things should be different, or they should have known this or that. Sometimes, it just seems that way. But there are other times where we don't know exactly what was going on. And one of the great things that you can see in a historical movie is that they bring more visualization, more conception to what was going on in a time. So not only do we just have the facts of an event, we can also get the emotional view. We can get, smaller things, day by day things, to help us better understand what was really going on at the time. So I really feel like you can't actually judge history, how history is going to be viewed from the present. Like I said, everyone in history, probably at the time when they were doing whatever they were doing, thought they were going to be on the right side. And what they're trying to say, or what they're actually saying about being on the right side of history, is that I'm doing something in the present that in the future is going to be viewed as correct. Well, you don't know what's going to be viewed correct. You don't know how much more information is going to be accessible. Like today, in a time where big tech is censoring and limiting the type of information and the amount of information you can share. Well, what happens when all that information is released in the future? We think we'll be on the right side of history now, but we don't know about what the concept is going to be, how much more information people will have, and what they'll be able to look at, because they'll be able to see the results of our actions. So yes, you might think you're doing the right thing. So yes, you might think you're on the right side of history, but only time will tell And of course, again, when more things are known, more information is held, and those things can actually be weighted or judged against other things. That's the only time we can know that we're on the right side of history. So I really think this phrase of being on the right side of history is backwards because of the way that it's judging and how it's trying to look forward but backward at the same time and doing stuff in the present. It's also very assumptive of what's going to come in the future and what's going to be seen and known in the future. Again, it's vain, it's lighthearted, it makes us think, or it makes us appear to think more than we actually know. And it totally ignores the future because we don't know, again, what's going to happen in the future or how things will be seen. The last thing about this phrase is kind of funny, especially when you hear people on the left use this phrase, because a lot of people who aren't believers, many people who aren't believers don't have a belief system even outside of Christianity, have this postmodern thing where they believe that they can have their truth and I can have my truth and she can have her truth and they can all have their truth. And so they don't believe in actual true truth. They don't believe that there's a true right and wrong. They only believe that things are right or wrong based on how we see it. Well, if that's true, if that is the case, that my truth will be my truth, or the truth of this time can be the truth of this time compared to the truth of another time, you have no idea how the truth of history will be viewed. So if you want to be on the right side of history, you need to be on the right side of God, because he's the only thing, the only person that's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So he goes on to say the right side of history. He says, which of course is anti-racism. All these things almost make me laugh because of the side that they're supported. I'm not trying to throw a whole bunch of shade at Lecraes, maybe a little bit, but the most important thing for us to really focus on is what he said, whether or not we agree with that, and to not just go along with culture the way that it swings. So he says that he's on the side of anti-racism, but that's really not true. The side of the left likes to use racism to combat racism or to deal with racism. So when they saw, or we have this type of racism in our history, they think the only way that you can deal with that or to right that wrong is to reverse it and to switch racism. So instead of these people being treated negatively because of their race, these people will now be treated negatively because of their race. Or the people that were treated negatively of their race are to be exalted and put on a pedestal. A lot of Christians and what we're seeing in the church is a lot of progressive Christianity, and they are going in this direction where it's almost like fighting fire with fire, if you will. But instead, again, of ending racism, they perpetuate racism, they use racism, and they thereby increase racism. So it's interesting that he's promoting a side that likes to use racism. The left, is typically very racist. They're very race conscious. They like to see everything based on race. They like to judge everything based on race. They like to write policy based on race. And that is what racism is. When you do things based on race, that's racism. I think it's the same whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. You can have racism that doesn't treat other races negatively per se, but it treats one race superiorly. But you can also have racism that doesn't teach or doesn't deal with their race in a superior fashion, but it's very negative toward another race. So racism is racism. If you're doing things consistently based on race or a little bit based on race, that is in and of itself racism. What we get from our left and what we get from our Democrat Party, in particular, what's being supported in this post, is not actually anti-racism, and people have got to wake up to this and understand what's really going on. I mean, isn't it racist when you think that black people should get the coronavirus vaccine before anyone else? Don't you think it's racist when you allow this race of people to get into a college with these scores, but this other race of people, they have to get in with different other scores? I mean, there were people going back talking about how we should have Ebonics as an accepted language to be taught in schools. And there were people that talked about how blacks couldn't compete in the spelling bee, and blacks never win the spelling bee, and so we need to have our own spelling bee. And all those things are racist because they're saying because of race, these things happen, and so we need to do something else, again, based on race. So then he goes on to say, pro-life from womb to the tomb. Like, really? I mean, does he not know what the Biden-Harris administration is about? Does he not know what the left is about, has been about, has promoted for the longest time? The left is not pro-life. Pro-life is particularly used when you're talking about allowing or causing babies to be born. So many people are pro-death, they're pro-abortion, because that's the opposite of pro-life. The side that he's on, the side that he's promoting right now, is not pro-life. Look at who he's talking about. You have the President, Joe Biden, who signed an order that increases abortion availability and promotes abortion. And not only does it do that, but it uses taxpayer dollars to promote abortion. Then you have Kamala Harris. She's a supporter of late-term abortion. She's 100% full-fledged on board with abortion. Then you have the side that they're on, the left side, the Democrat side, the side that's being promoted. Don't forget the governor out of Virginia, Ralph Northam, who was promoting not too long ago after he got caught in some blackface photographs from his college days. He was bringing up, to probably change the subject, but he started bringing up some legislation that they wanted to produce in Virginia, which is accepted, I believe, in other states, or had been talked about in other states, where they want to allow a baby to be born, put in another room, and his words, kept comfortable, while they talk with the mother and find out if the mother wants to keep the child. And if she doesn't want to keep the child, they would go ahead and kill an already born, healthy, perfectly fine child, saying that that's the right of the woman because it's her body. Even though it's a body inside of a body, they say it's a woman's body and therefore it's a woman's choice. They are not at all pro-life. So you have infanticide on one side, but they also, the left is okay with terminating our seniors, or if not terminating our seniors so much, like they're for assisted suicide and stuff like that. And that's another conversation if you want to have it. But if we go back to Obamacare, remember, there was a young lady that she stood up and asked a question, and she said, she was talking about her mom's will to live. She was in her 90s, and her mom was able to get a surgery, and I believe like a pacemaker or something like that, and had been alive for another 5 years. And so she was asking the president if his Obamacare had anything in it that would allow that to happen. And the president, Obama's words to her were, well, that's kind of subjective. I don't think we can get into that. Sometimes we just need to give people a pill and make them comfortable in the time that they have left. So they're not pro-life when it comes to the babies. They're, according to their healthcare plans that the Biden wants to reform and reinstitute and beef up a little bit, and he wants to call it Biden Care. According to their healthcare plans, they're not pro-life on the other end of the life spectrum. The only place they can say they're pro-life is when it comes to convicted killers, rapists, and whatever other things that people do that would grant them the death penalty. The death penalty is the only place where the left and where Democrats can say that they're pro-life. They're okay with killing the innocent babies that did nothing wrong, that have their own bodies, even though they want to say they're not a person, they're not a body. They're okay with taking that life away. But on the other hand, they're not okay with ending a life of people who've ended other lives or have broken our worst crimes, who have done the worst things imaginable. Now, capital punishment, again, can be another conversation and another thing, but you have to look at these two things juxtaposed. We're okay with killing babies, but we're not okay with killing the killers. What kind of sense does that make? So, again, he goes on to say that his side is to care for the marginalized. I kind of disagree with that one too. They care for some marginalized, sort of, but not a lot of other marginalized. And even if we define care, some people's care is just enabling, and it doesn't help fix a problem, or it doesn't really help a person out. It just makes them comfortable in their messed up situation. That's usually the kind of care you're going to get from the left. But let's just look at their care for the marginalized. Well, they say they care for the marginalized, and so they want to raise the minimum wage. But the minimum wage is going to be another thing that wrecks the economy and that has really bad consequences, more negative consequences than it will positives about it. But that's something that they want to do, right? But they don't care for the marginalized and how that's going to ruin the teenage job market. All right, we're not hiring teenagers for $15 an hour, getting them a head start on life, teaching them work principles and things like that, because you're going to have to give that $15 to an adult. And so you can kiss working as a teenager goodbye if they get that $15 minimum wage. It's supposed to be good, but in fact, it's not really. They don't actually care about the marginalized that continue to be trafficked over our border. You know, they say that slavery is more prevalent today than at any time in our history. So they support illegal immigrants and illegal immigration, which then causes people to be trafficked illegally out of other countries and put into a sex or slave trade. It also causes, talking about the marginalized, the border policies that say, okay, well, if somebody comes in a family unit, we're going to treat them differently. We don't want to separate families. We want to keep them. We don't let them come in. We'll just let them into the interior, and then we'll tell them to come back to court in 6 or 9 months, and we'll see what they do. Well, what happens? Parents in other countries were either paid or their children were abducted, and their children were brought across the border with people that were not their parents, so that when those people, they got to the border and got questioned, they'll say, oh, this is my child, because we would be more lenient on them, and then we would go ahead and bring them into the interior. So a lot of people were complaining about the kids in cages and the family separations, which started under the Obama administration. One of the reasons they were doing that is because they found out kids were being trafficked. They wanted to separate them to keep the children safe, so they could find out. There was another article that came out not long before the election, and they were criticizing Trump, whose a policy it wasn't, but they were criticizing him because there were a bunch of children in detention whose parents couldn't be found. Why were there children in detention whose parents couldn't be found? Not because they were released into the interior, not because the parents wanted to find those kids, but because those kids were brought illegally by people who were not their family, that did not care what happened to the kid after they got what they wanted. So that's the real reason those kids were unfortunately left behind. But it's the policies of the left that promote these actions. They don't care about the marginalized from the 2020 riots and all those cities that experienced huge riots and protests and things like that. There were lots of minority-owned businesses that were destroyed or damaged. They didn't care about those marginalized. They encouraged the protesters. They gave them space to destroy, as one mayor said. Governors didn't call out the National Guard to protect the people because they wanted to let the bad people, the rioters, they wanted to give them an opportunity to vent. And don't forget, Kamala Harris, the side that Lecraes is on apparently with this, said it's not going to stop and it shouldn't stop and they're not going to let up. She was in full support. So they weren't really caring for the marginalized that needed help. They weren't caring for the marginalized in Portland, where they allowed the Chaz Chop zone to be taken over. There were businesses within that zone that weren't allowed to do and conduct business the way they wanted to because the city decided to give that area over to criminals. And they weren't taking care of protecting those marginalized. They're not protecting the marginalized police who've been targeted and attacked at a super high level recently. They're not caring for the marginalized when, you know, the police are getting laser beamed and some of them are going blind from that, getting attacked, shot in their vehicles and disrespected at probably an all-time high. I don't know. But they don't care for those marginalized, do they? They even care so little for the marginalized that they close the schools so they can cause fear to be promoted, so they can milk the pandemic for everything that it was worth. They don't care about the marginalized kids who needed to be at school because they needed the food programs, which is something that they push and promote, which is, it is what it is. But they also don't protect the marginalized, knowing that domestic violence had increased, suicide increased because of the closures and things that were going on. Kids were falling behind in school because of those closures that were going on. They didn't take care of those marginalized. And back to the 2020 protests, they didn't take care of the marginalized business owners and people that were hurt and police that were hurt, so much to the tune that they weren't worried about the marginalized, that, Kamala Harris was raising money along with others on the left to bail out the people that got arrested for rioting, for breaking the law, for breaking other people's stuff. They raised bail money for them, number one. And number two, the lefty district attorneys, the Democrat district attorneys, didn't even bring charges against those people who were found to have broken the law. How much care for the marginalized do we see from these people? Or then he says he's anti-Christian nationalism. What does that mean? I would love a definition for Christian nationalism. If you know of one, put it in the comments. Let me know exactly what you think about that. But he's anti-Christian nationalism. And there's been, a lot of talk about that and how the church is deceived and they think America is the Bible and biblical and all this kind of stuff. And, United States is a Christian nation. The reason that you can have all these protesters, you can have the voting that we do and all the rights and civil liberties and things that we do is because the United States was built on Judeo-Christian values. If not for those values, the people complaining, the people that are raising Cain and acting crazy right now would not be able to do that. It's those Judeo-Christian values that are being manipulated and abused by people that gives them the power to abuse it. There are a lot of people that come from Mexico to the United States illegally, but if you go into Mexico illegally, their illegal immigration crimes or punishments are way worse than ours. But they think it's okay for people to come to our interior, but they don't think it's okay for people to go in there. So we're not caring for the marginalized, again, the point before, but this Christian nationalism point, I don't understand what he's saying by that. If people, his side is against Christian nationalism, they're also against Christianity. It's not just a collective Christian nationalism per se. They're against the whole kit and caboodle of Christianity. So don't think they just want to get rid of Christian nationalism and separate the Christians from their nation or whatever their idea might be. I don't know what they prefer. Just absolute globalism, secularly. Last thing he refers to is the abuse of power, the anti-abuse of power side. The ridiculousness is monumental, but we'll talk about it. He's talking about the anti-abuse of power side, the side that just won the election. Let's take a moment and go through. Who won the election? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, okay? Joe Biden's son is under investigation for his role in the influence peddling and doing favors for foreign nations scheme. They have proof on the computer. Son's now under investigation. The proof that they have not only deals with the son, which it would be his own crime, but it also implies our now president, Joseph Biden, who was abusing his power by taking money from foreign entities and doing favors, doing things for them while he was getting paid. He was getting his son paid, and he was also getting his brother paid. So there's abuse of power. You also have Joe Biden on record saying that he withheld or was going to withhold $1 billion from the United States to the country of Ukraine. He was telling the president, he said this in his own words, that he wasn't going to allow the $1 billion to come from the United States to Ukraine if they didn't fire the prosecutor who was supposed to be investigating corruption, the prosecutor who may have been involved in doing some things with his son's company and his son's business. That was told, or it was reported that prosecutor was investigating the company that the son worked for, represented, the company that was paying him millions of dollars, and even though he had no experience, no anything that would qualify him for the job, this is the side that Lecraes is saying is anti-abusive power. He's also saying the side of abusive power for our vice president, Kamala Harris. She's on record convicting people, prosecuting people for smoking weed, but then she goes on a talk show and talks about how, yeah, sometimes I smoke a little weed, it's okay. She does that. She also is a person who, I believe there was a story about how she prosecuted an innocent person, and then when they were trying to get the truth, she was trying to block the other investigators from finding out the truth about this person who was wrongly convicted. Abuse of power. She also has a history of being promoted through less than proper means, according to one of her old bosses. And so she's for the abuse of power as long as it gets her where she wants, right? You also had the abuse of power dealing with the whole Russia collusion. They spied on an American president. They spied on an American citizen under the guise of the Russia collusion, which was investigated. It was talked about for years. It was peddled and pushed and promoted for years. No evidence. And then the evidence that does come to the surface actually shows Democrats, the people on the left, abusing their power. All the way up to Barack Obama. You got Hillary Clinton in there. Joe Biden was in there. And there are other people who were abusing their power to try and tie Donald Trump, wrongly, illegally, to Russians. And then they were saying that his election in 2016 was fraudulent because of all this stuff that happened with the Russians. And supposedly it was the Russians who helped get him into office. Does that sound familiar? But now when there's actual evidence, actual people standing up to say that our election was fraudulent in 2020, then you get kicked off your social media sites. So talk about a peaceful transition of power, which was so popular not long ago, but the transition of power before that was being spied on illegally, and power was abused. So I hope Lecraes can get some right, accurate information. Again, it's very important for us not to just take things that are reported or said or tweeted or text. We can't just take them at face value, because while they might sound good, nice, warm, and fuzzy, they're absolutely false. And you don't want to follow false information. So make sure that you get right information. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you think. Everything I said is verifiable. You can look it up. You might not be able to Google it because they like to hide stuff. You might have to go to Bing or DuckDuckGo. Anyway, that's it for me. I'm out of here. I'm C. Scott. That is how I see it.